Welcome to the Computer Security Seminar. Our speaker today is Rick Aldrich of Booz Allen Hamilton, and he will talk about what's new in Cyberlaw, an overview of recent legal developments. Rick.
Thank you very much. I come to you today from Washington, D.C. That's where I primarily work. And my primary client is the Department of Defense Chief Information Officer. So some of the cases that I'll be presenting to you today will have a military flavor, but all of them have more general application to virtually any federal agency or to any state agency or even a lot of times to corporate entities. What I'd like to do is run this as informally as possible, so if you have any questions at any point, just raise your hand. I'll also be asking you some questions, so I'd like to see if we can get some interactivity that way too. Although I am an attorney, this presentation is not legal advice, and I have the full disclaimer down there in the fine print. So if there is anything that you want to take action on, you should actually seek an attorney for the specific facts and circumstances of that case. This is just general legal principles that will help you become more aware. Why this briefing? Basically, I'd like to update you on some of the cutting-edge legal developments in cyberspace because this is a very immature area, so the law tends to change quite rapidly, especially in response to changes in technology. And a lot of the things do impact information security and information assurance, so I wanted to highlight some of those for you today. The first thing I wanted to do is talk about on the international scene, what do we have? And the primary thing we have on the international scene is the Cybercrime Convention. And as you can see by the slide, that was ratified in 2004 by the necessary 5 parties. The United States signed it at that time, but didn't actually ratify it until 2006. And it took effect for the United States in 2007. As you can see there, 26 nations have ratified it so far. But if you look at the list, it's kind of a mixed bag. A lot of small countries, some major countries that you might expect to be in there have not ratified it yet. So we're still looking for more things there. There's a couple issues that are identified down there that have caused some people some consternation about this treaty. Overall, most people think it's good, but a couple issues down there. One of them is lack of dual criminality. Does anyone know what dual criminality means, what that concept means? Okay, does anyone remember when we had the I love you virus that spread pretty much around the world? And where did they eventually track the person who wrote that code to? The Philippines, correct. Now, did we ever prosecute that individual? No. And why didn't we? The reason is because it wasn't a crime in the Philippines. So even though we have an extradition treaty with the Philippines, unless it's a felony both in the United States and in the Philippines isn't required to extradite the individual. Now, if he were to travel to, say, like Disneyland to celebrate this fact, then we could seize him while he's here, because then we don't have to worry about the extradition treaty. But so one of the issues here is that there's a lack of dual criminality for mutual legal assistance. And what that means is that countries could ask us to assist them on issues that weren't crimes in our country. And some people have a difficulty with that because some people have very strict laws with regard to what you can publish on the internet, which would violate our First Amendment. When I talk to people from the Department of Justice, they say that's not how we are interpreting this provision, and so it's not really an issue they don't believe. The other one would require the divulgence of a decryption key. And there's some somewhat vague language in the treaty that indicates there may be a necessity for law enforcement to assist in obtaining a decryption key. And in our country, that can be somewhat difficult because of our Fifth Amendment, right against self-incrimination. So those are just a couple of issues that were raised. And, but overall, as I indicated, that's a very helpful treaty, especially the 24/7 points of contact. This allows any party to the treaty, and actually people who are party to this separate side treaty, to also use experts in the countries to help track down the perpetrators of cyber crimes. You can actually call up and ask them, okay, how do we get this data from you immediately, or how can you stop this, or how can you preserve this evidence? The next thing I'd like to turn to is the NATO treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's treaty. And the reason I bring this is some of you may be aware that Estonia and Georgia suffered some pretty significant cyber attacks on their infrastructure. Some of them weren't able to bank for a few days. They weren't able to use the internet. They weren't able to do a lot of things that they do by internet. And so some people asked, what was the implication of this? Does this constitute an attack against Estonia such that they could ask NATO to invoke the defense of all provision. And at the time, NATO said no, because NATO qualified it as a cyber riot. And a cyber riot doesn't count as an attack against a member. That's more like a civil disturbance. So they were able to finesse the issue that way. But I think it has caused a lot of people to look into the future and say, okay, how are we going to be able to deal with this in future situations? Because it looks increasingly like countries may use a cyber attack to either magnify or complement a more traditional kinetic attack. Okay, now within the United States, it's important to know what role you're playing to determine how the law applies to you. And because the way Congress has written our laws, there's relatively rigid lanes in four main areas. One is if you're a system provider, and that would be like if you're an ISP or you're a system administrator for a university, things like that. Those are all in the category of system provider. There's a certain body of law that applies to them that allows them to do things that other people can't. Even without separate consent or anything else. They're allowed to do certain things in that role that other people can't. Another role is law enforcement. Another role is counterintelligence. And a fourth role is when we're actually involved in war, the war fighters. What can they do? So those are the four main areas. And we'll touch on those a little bit as we go through some of the case discussions that I have later on. Now, if you look at this spectrum, I've kind of tried to place on there where different types of activities would go. So you have ping on the far left, which is basically you just trying to determine whether a port is open. Some have made it akin to a knock on the door, where you're just trying to say, is anyone home? Now, that might, if you were doing a broad ping, that might be a little bit more like checking each window, checking the fire escape, etc. But most courts have held that a ping is not illegal. Now, it could become illegal, just like knocking on the door could become illegal. If you continue to knock on your neighbor's door and then run away and then knock again and run away and knock again, that's generally some type of criminal mischief in most jurisdictions. And likewise, if you do a ping of death, such that you ping a computer so many times that it can no longer function or you seriously degrade its ability to function, that would constitute a crime. But basically on the far left are those things which generally won't constitute a crime, and on the far right, the far more serious things which could actually constitute cyber war. And the things in the middle, and the reason I have it just phased in, is that there's no strict cutoff points. What could constitute cyber terrorism could also constitute cyber crime, and it may even be constitute cyber espionage. Although certain times it's going to depend on who the sponsor is. So generally, in the legal sense, a nation state has to be the sponsor of cyber war. So when Chinese individuals were attacking the United States and United States hackers were attacking back at China over a P3 incident that was some years back, a Navy spy plane, some people in the press said there's a cyber war going on. But it wouldn't technically be a cyber war unless the nations were behind it, unless they were sponsoring it. And it wasn't so clear that that was the case. And that was also the case with the Estonia issue. A lot of people weren't able to attribute the source of that specifically to any one nation. Several people theorized that Russia was behind it, but other people said, no, it looks like Russia is just acquiescing in it, that there may be a whole lot of subordinate actors doing it. And that's part of the problem in this whole area, is actually being able to attribute the source. Cyber terrorism, you're generally looking there at a sponsor who is trying to do something for political or religious reasons. So they're trying to make a big impact, and oftentimes they will commit cyber crimes in order to do that. And cyber espionage, we're also looking at a nation-state sponsor generally there. Now, the law is constantly changing, as I told you, and the most recent change to the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act occurred last year. Under the, strangely enough, the former Vice President Protection Act is where it came under, because it happened to encompass some things about that too. But a couple of things, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but a couple of things, it for the first time made it a crime to conspire to commit a computer crime. Prior to that, you could conspire to commit, and there was no separate crime for that. So now there is. And then, most importantly, perhaps, it eliminated the requirement that damage to a victim's computer exceed $5,000 in certain types of offenses, because in some cases that was a little bit difficult to prove. So it reduced that necessity. Oops. Okay, so now I'm going to go into some cases, some actual cases, and I'm going to give you the facts, and then I want